My name is Noreen and this is Real Africa Stories. I share the history you were never shown growing up, but I'm here to show you. Today's story is one I've been wanting to cover for a long time, because if you ask many East Africans to name the most iconic resistance movement in their region, they'll tell you about the Dervish State of Somalia, a story of poetry, bravery, betrayal, empire, and a fight that lasted 21 years. Before we begin, I want to say something clearly. You know, I only bring you stories that are verified, well-researched, and grounded in real history. Of course, I'm human, and I may make errors. But this is what the records, archives, and historians say. And once you hear the full story, you'll understand why this chapter changed the politics of the Horn of Africa forever. If you think you know Somali history, stay with me, because this is the story of one man who took on 3 global empires and nearly won. The twist is this: the Dervish movement didn't begin as a war, it began as a spiritual awakening. Sayyid Mohammed Abdullah Hassan was born in 1856 in the Somali interior. He was a poet, a scholar, and a man who travelled widely across the Islamic world. He studied in Sudan, Mecca, and Ethiopia. He came home to find his land slowly falling under British influence in the north, Italian presence in the south, and Ethiopian expansion from the west. The Somali coast was being carved up without consent, and he watched local leaders sign agreements with colonial officers who arrived with maps and promises. To him, this wasn't just politics. It was a threat to Somali spirituality, culture, and unity, but also a personal calling. He believed he was meant to stand against it. So he formed a movement, not a militia, not an army, a spiritual order called the Salahiyya. But within a few years, it became something much more. The movement grew quickly. His followers called themselves the Dervishes. They were strict, disciplined, and deeply loyal. Colonizers mocked them in their reports, but Somalis called them the Darawish. The trigger that ignited everything was simple. Local communities who refused colonial rule looked to the Sayyid for leadership, and colonial powers realized that a unifying Somali resistance leader was dangerous. British officials wrote about him in fearful tones. They wanted him stopped before his influence spread across the region, and so conflict began. In 1899, Britain launched its first operation against the Dervishes. But there was one problem. They underestimated Somali mobility. The Dervishes didn't fight like an Ethiopian army. They moved fast, rode horses, and knew every inch of the desert terrain. They could vanish into the plains and reappear miles away. Battle after battle, the British struggled, and so did the Italians and the Ethiopians. 3 powers, 1 Somali movement, and still the Dervishes held their ground. By the early 1900s, the Sayyid controlled large parts of the interior. He established a capital at Talale, where he built stone forts that still stand today. He wasn't simply a rebel. He was building a state. One thing about Somali history that Western textbooks ignore is the power of poetry. The Sayyid wasn't just a leader. He was a master poet. When he won battles, he wrote poetry. When he lost, he wrote poetry. When he wanted to unite people, he wrote poetry. And when he wanted to shame those who collaborated with colonizers, he wrote poetry too. His words traveled far beyond his territory, and they stung. Even the British were shocked at how quickly his verses spread across the region. They understood that his poetry was as dangerous as his fighters. For Somali identity, this era proved something powerful. A poet can be a warrior can be a scholar, and a scholar can lead a nation. Between 1900 and 1910, the Dervish state became a real political force. It had fortified cities, a taxation system, a hierarchical leadership, alliances across clan lines, diplomatic correspondence with foreign powers, and a clear anti-colonial vision. This was one of the earliest African liberation states of the 20th century. decades before independence movements swept the continent. But the British were determined to remove him, and they were ready to escalate. Here's the part that shocks most people. In 1920, Britain launched one of the most aggressive campaigns in East Africa. For the first time in African history, they used aerial bombing. Aircrafts flew over the Somali interior and bombed Talale. The Sayyid's capital was destroyed. His forces were scattered. The balance shifted. This wasn't a local conflict anymore. It was empire versus a Somali liberation movement. And Britain had brought in modern war into the Horn of Africa. After the bombing, the Dervish state never recovered. Sayyid Mohammed Abdullah Hassan retreated westwards. He died in 1920 from illness, not battle. But his impact didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger. Somalis remembered him as the first figure to attempt pan-Somali unity, the first to declare that Somali destiny should never be written by foreigners, and the first to show that resistance can build identity. This is not just a Somali story. It is a Somali stand against partition, an African stand against empire, a Muslim resistance story, a cultural story of poetry and identity, a reminder that Africa has its own heroes, and a challenge to the colonial narrative found in school textbooks. And here's the part I want you to think about. Africa's resistance movements didn't start in the 1950s. They didn't start with political parties. They didn't start with independence declarations. They started with leaders like the Sayyid, leaders who believed in their land, language, and the faith that it was worth defending. Leaders who fought even when empires united against them. This is the Africa you're not shown, but I'm here to show you. If you'd like a part 2 exploring the battles in detail, or the poetry of the Sayyid, or the political legacy of the Dervish era in modern Somalia, tell me below. And if you're new here, follow and subscribe for more African history the world chose to ignore.